You're sitting at Marcus's dinner table, plate still half full, when the conversation turns to mortgage payoff versus brokerage accounts, and the room splits into two camps like the answer is obvious. Pay it down. No, invest instead. Voices piling on top of each other. You just nod because you already made that call 6 years ago. Chose the payoff, signed the final check, sealed the envelope. Nobody at that table ever asked what it actually cost you. You walked that envelope to the mailbox by yourself. That's where the real arithmetic began, the true price of what that loan had been taking from you. The letter never spelled out 6 years of history. That unfolded on its own, standing by the mailbox. Watching a neighbor kid circle the cul-de-sac on a bike while your mind ran numbers nobody had asked you to run. Every other Saturday at 8 in the morning, you and Renee at the kitchen island. Coffee, laptop open to the loan servicer's dashboard. $1,900 typed into the transfer box like a pulse you didn't get to control. You hit send. You watched the balance leave. Some mornings it barely registered. Some mornings it was all you could think about. A little over a year ago, Renee walked in from her shift at Crestview Medical, phone already in her hand before she'd even kicked off her shoes. A physical therapy startup out of Austin wanted her. Lower base salary, real equity, the kind of gamble that either rewrites your future or costs you 2 years you'll never get back. You remember sitting on the edge of the bed with her, running the numbers 3 different times, hoping for a different result each time. It never changed. The 1900 was already committed. The startup wasn't. She turned it down by text, in bed, close to midnight, and neither of you said much about it afterward. That's the piece nobody mentions when they talk about buying a house. It's not just a monthly bill. It becomes the lens every decision passes through first. Can we still make the transfer? That question arrives before anything else does. 3 weeks later, you were on the couch scrolling Zillow after Renee had drifted off against your shoulder, and a listing popped up in your saved search. A 4-bedroom colonial on the water in Cornelius, dock included, $2.3 million. You didn't dwell on the price tag, you dwelled on the dock. That oddly specific, entirely useless detail of a boat you don't own, attached to a house you'll never buy. You closed the tab before she could wake up and ask why you were even looking. Here's what the actual numbers looked like, if you'd ever bothered to write them down, which you hadn't until that night with the envelope in hand. Between the two of you, take-home pay after taxes and Renee's 401k contribution landed around $126,000 a year. Call it roughly $7,800 hitting the account monthly. The mortgage claimed $1,900 of it. Property tax on a home valued near $370,000 in the county ran close to $300 a month once spread out. Homeowners insurance, which had crept upward 5 years running, national averages pushing near $3,000 annually, added another $240 or so. 2 car payments, groceries for 2 working adults, utilities, the cable bill you kept at, meaning to renegotiate. Tally it all, and what remained most months was somewhere south of $200. $200! That was your entire margin for error. That was the line between an ordinary month and a rough one. You never thought of it as fragile. You thought of it as normal, because everyone around you seemed to live inside some version of that same figure. But normal and secure are not the same word, and you'd been using them interchangeably for years. So when the notice arrived confirming the loan was fully satisfied, part of you assumed the 200 would simply transform into 2100. Assumed the filter would just disappear. No more checking with a spreadsheet before agreeing to anything. That's where you were wrong, and you wouldn't understand why until the first bill showed up that had nothing to do with a mortgage at all. What actually shifts once it's gone? The first Saturday with no transfer scheduled, your phone still buzzed at 8, an old alert you'd forgotten to disable. You looked at it from bed and felt your stomach do the familiar dip, that half second of dread before remembering there was nothing left to send. That sensation never returned after that morning, and you hadn't fully registered how much room it had been occupying until it was simply absent. You felt it most clearly at the office during a Tuesday check-in with your manager, a guy named Trevor, who oversaw the regional sales team out of the downtown office. He was reviewing new territory assignments, And when he reached yours, a rough patch of accounts in Ohio nobody wanted, worse quota, heavier travel, you heard yourself say, "That doesn't work for me," in a tone you barely recognized. Steady, not anxious. Half a year earlier, you'd have accepted it with a smile because turning down anything felt like tempting a number you couldn't afford to gamble with. Trevor blinked, said he'd look into alternatives, and that was the end of it. No fallout. The version of you still carrying $1,900 a month of obligation would have spent the entire drive home replaying what he must be thinking. This version of you simply drove home. There's a term for what happened here, even if nobody at your kitchen table would have called it that. Researchers studying people after their debts were forgiven found something notable. A study in a major national science journal a few years back showed anxiety symptoms fell by roughly 25 percentage points, almost immediately once the debt disappeared. Not gradually, almost immediately. Something about carrying an obligation reshapes how your brain operates in the background all day. And something about its removal hands that capacity straight back to you. What dropped for you specifically was your floor, the absolute minimum you needed to bring in each month just to keep the house. Yours had fallen by $1,900 overnight. And a lower floor isn't only about extra cash, it's the reason you can say something honest to your manager during a one-on-one. It's the difference between a bad quarter being uncomfortable versus catastrophic. People who study this will tell you that eliminating housing debt is one of the stronger predictors of someone finally launching the business, or accepting the pay cut, or making the move they'd been talking themselves out of for years, because the risk that once felt unaffordable suddenly isn't. You felt a version of that within weeks. Not a business, just permission. You picked up the extra Friday shift at your gym that Renee kept nudging you to try teaching, the one you'd always declined because the pay was negligible and the $1,900 left no room for anything extra. Now it did. $50 additional a week you didn't need, spent doing something you'd actually wanted your Fridays to look like. For roughly 3 weeks, it felt like the whole equation had resolved itself. Bigger paycheck, freer decisions, quieter mind. You briefly let yourself believe this was simply what being debt-free felt like from here forward. Then the notice arrived from the county, property taxes reassessed, due at month's end. Not folded into any loan anymore, not something your old servicer would ever collect on your behalf again. Just yours now, direct and in full. You stood in the kitchen holding it, and for the first time since mailing that final payment, you ran the numbers again. It wasn't a small figure, and it was the first hint that paid off, and free weren't going to mean the same thing after all. Why being paid off isn't the same as being free. The property tax bill got handled. You moved the money out of savings without much fuss, told yourself it was a one-time thing, and mostly forgot about it until the Tuesday your car refused to start in a shopping center parking lot. The tow truck driver, a guy named Ray, who'd clearly seen this exact moment play out 100 times, popped the hood for 4 minutes and delivered a number that didn't feel real. Transmission, not the battery. $2,800, maybe more once it was up on the lift. You stood there running math you'd already run once that month. Except this time the answer rattled you because here's what you actually had on hand. Liquid, movable in an afternoon money, sitting at roughly $9,400 in your brokerage account. That was the entire cushion. On paper, you'd never been worth more. The house alone, appraised that same month near $380,000, fully owned, no lender attached, made you look on any net worth calculator like someone thriving. Add the brokerage balance, add the equity sitting in both vehicles, and the figure your investment app displayed for your household reads something close to $410,000. None of that mattered in that parking lot. You called your bank that evening, the branch downtown where you'd opened your very first checking account, and asked about a home equity line, figuring an owned house had to count for something. The loan officer was courteous about it, said they'd still need to verify income relative to the requested amount. Said approval wasn't automatic just because the equity existed. Said the process could take 2 to 3 weeks, even in a best-case scenario. 2 to 3 weeks. Your car needed fixing by Thursday. You can't hand a mechanic a piece of drywall. You can't pay him with a slice of your roof. In the moment a real bill lands, a fully paid off house delivers exactly nothing. No cash flow, no next day answer, nothing you can put on a counter. Yeah. It just sits there, appreciating, sealed shut. You ended up pulling $2,800 directly from the brokerage account, the only place that could actually move fast enough, and watch the balance drop from $9,400 to just over $6,500 in a single transaction. That was the moment it truly sank in, not as an abstract headline, but as a feeling in your chest standing at your own counter. You'd spent years funneling every spare dollar toward eliminating a debt. In exchange, you'd received a certificate of appreciation from the county assessor and a house that couldn't help you on an ordinary Tuesday. Renee found you still holding your phone, screen open to the brokerage balance, and asked what was wrong. You told her the number was wrong. Not low exactly. Wrong in the sense that it didn't match the safety you'd been telling yourself you had. That same week, passing a jewelry case at the mall while waiting on a table at a nearby restaurant, you caught yourself actually pricing a Rolex Submariner, tag reading just over $10,000. Not because you intended to buy it, but because for one honest, foolish second, the watch and your emergency fund occupied the exact same mental category. $10,000 sitting there, doing nothing, until the day it mattered. The only difference was which one you could actually justify wanting. You didn't buy the watch. You didn't need to. It had already taught you everything you needed to know. Money that isn't liquid isn't really yours yet, no matter what it's worth on paper, no matter whose name sits on the deed. What you hadn't calculated yet was what all that redirected cash would actually be worth today if it had never gone toward the mortgage at all. What the payoff actually cost you. You didn't revisit that question until Independence Day, standing in Marcus's backyard, holding a beer you weren't really drinking, listening to him complain about his interest rate. Marcus had just closed on a place 2 streets over, roughly the same size as yours. He'd locked in at 6.5% and said the number like it physically pained him, said his loan officer called that decent for the current market. You nodded politely along, but some uninvited part of your brain pulled up the rate on your own original loan from years back, 3.875%. You'd forgotten you'd ever had it that good. You'd spent 6 years treating that loan like an enemy, throwing every spare dollar at killing it early, and standing in that backyard, you finally let yourself ask the question. You'd been avoiding since the parking lot. What if you hadn't rushed it? You ran the numbers that night, sitting in your car before even pulling out of the driveway, calculator app open, headlights off. You and Renee had been sending roughly $800 a month, beyond what the servicer actually required, extra principal, on purpose, proud of it at the time. The entire reason you'd finished a 30-year loan in 6, $800 a month, redirected elsewhere instead for those same 6 years, then continued for years beyond that to match the full original term. You knew the stock market had historically averaged something close to 10% annually over long stretches. So you ran the math at that rate, monthly, compounding. The figure that came back stopped you cold, roughly $600,000. Not the mortgage payoff amount, the amount you'd have had, instead sitting in a brokerage account. If that same $800 a month had gone into an index fund the entire time instead of toward your loan balance. You sat with that for a while. $600,000, not stolen, not lost, simply never built, because the version of you back then couldn't tolerate the discomfort of still technically owing money while your net worth quietly grew somewhere else. You traded a 3.875% obligation, one that got cheaper every year as your income rose and inflation chipped away at what the bank was owed, for the chance to sleep marginally better at night. Nobody explains that part at closing. A locked-in low rate isn't a burden, it's leverage. Inflation is quietly working in your favor the entire time you're carrying it. The lender agreed years earlier to accept a fixed dollar amount that buys less with every passing year. Every year you kept that loan instead of racing to erase it, you were repaying it slightly cheaper than the year before, while your $800 could have been earning nearly triple what you were saving in interest. You thought about the designer handbag Renee had bookmarked years back, medium size, well over $11,000. The one she never bought because it felt indefensible next to a mortgage. It wasn't the bag itself sitting in your mind that night. It was the realization that the real question had never been indulgence versus restraint. It had been about which asset compounds and which one just sits there. For 6 years, you'd been feeding the one that doesn't. You drove home slower than usual. Renee asked what was wrong when you walked in, and you told her the truth. Nothing was wrong exactly. You just worked out the alternate version of the last 6 years, one where you'd both maxed out your 401k match, contributed the full annual IRS limit each, kept the individual retirement account maxed on the side too, and you'd probably be looking at a number with the comma in a different spot than the one you actually had. There wasn't anger in it, just the particular quiet weight of finally knowing exactly what a decision had cost you, in real numbers, for the first time. What you needed now wasn't regret. It was a way to never make that trade blindly again. The following weekend, Renee found you in the driveway staring at your 8-year-old sedan like it had personally betrayed you. You'd pulled up a listing for a new BMW the night before, fully loaded, close to $60,000 out the door, and told yourself it made sense now. No mortgage payment, an extra $1,900 a month with nowhere assigned to go. You'd already priced the loan, 6 years, easily fitting the new budget. Renee didn't argue about the car. She asked one question. Where was that $1,900 actually going to go if you didn't spend it on something? You didn't have an answer, and that was exactly the problem. By then, you'd read enough to know the name for what nearly happened to you in that driveway. Economists call it Parkinson's Law when it shows up in personal finance. Spending expands to fill whatever space opens up automatically, unless you deliberately tell it not to. A large share of people who finally pay off a mortgage go out and buy a nicer car, or renovate the kitchen, and within about 18 months feel exactly as squeezed as they did before, just with a nicer garage. The ceiling rises to meet the floor every time unless someone stops it on purpose. So you and Renee sat at the kitchen table that Sunday, the same table as the envelope, the same table as every other Saturday transfer for 6 years, and did something different with the $1,900. You set up an automatic transfer to hit your brokerage account the same morning your paycheck landed. Same date each month, same habit. Just redirected, automatic, so you'd never again have to make that decision while the money sat in checking looking spendable. First, both of you captured the full 401k match. Free money neither of you had ever fully claimed, while the mortgage was eating the difference. Then you built out your Roth IRA contributions to the annual limit each, the kind of ceiling that used to feel abstract and now just read like a line item. Whatever remained went straight into the same brokerage account that had bailed you out in that parking lot, except now it was growing on purpose instead of sitting there as an accident of circumstance. You didn't buy the BMW. The sedan kept starting mostly, but you started thinking about mortgages themselves differently too, not as something to fear paying off again, but as a tool to actually use correctly next time. If there ever was a next time. If you ever refinanced or bought another property, the plan wouldn't be racing to zero. It would be locking in a low rate, then building a brokerage account large enough that the dividends alone could cover the payment. Mathematically debt-free, technically still holding the loan, but never vulnerable to a random Tuesday parking lot again. Your money working on the loan instead of your paycheck fighting it. 8 months into the new automatic transfer, you and Renee sat down and actually looked at the number. Not a hypothetical, a real one, sitting in the app past $34,000. Still nowhere close to that lakefront dock. Still nowhere close to a private jet you'd never seriously priced anyway. But real, liquid, yours, and moving in the right direction for the first time since you'd started chasing zero on a mortgage balance instead of chasing a number that could actually protect you. You'd spent 6 years building a monument. This was the first 8 months of building something else. What you're actually building now, you still remember exactly how it felt mailing that final envelope. But that's not the feeling you carry anymore. What you carry now is the $34,000 growing on an ordinary Tuesday you don't even bother checking. The house never did that. The house just sits there, the same as it always has, worth exactly what it's worth, whether you watch it or not. You'll notice it again soon, some unremarkable Sunday. A number in an app, a decision that used to frighten you and suddenly doesn't embond anymore. That's the real signal, not the deed with your name on it, but the choice that's finally actually yours to make. The house was never going to be the thing that set you free. So the question that actually belongs to you now isn't whether you own your home. It's what you're going to do with everything else.